Yes.
We may be able to get,
Ms. O'Neill down there a lot earlier. We're waiting to get confirmation from her, but she may be purchasing her own ticket and then we'll reimburse her. But I don't want to confirm it yet, but we may be able to get her down here by arriving in Orlando at noon.
Okay.
So we're working on that, but I don't want to.
Okay, she'll land at 12:25 early.
Okay.
Confirmed.
Okay.
All right, and that solves the issue. All right, if we could go get the jury then at this point. Oh, where's our witness? Yeah, or Sergeant Marlowe, can you step outside and see if he's there? And the jurors are prepared to go late today, so. The jurors are prepared to go late today. One had already indicated to the deputy that they had made arrangements, so they're prepared to go late today. All right, have a seat. You may be seated. All right. Continue with cross-examination.
Mr. Ruth, when you look at firearms and cartridges and bullets, you're looking at each one to compare them. That's correct? That's according to your methods?
I'm evaluating the individual characteristics, correct.
Right, you're looking at them. Isn't that correct?
Under a comparison microscope, yes.
Right, and then you determine whether one looks similar to the other. Isn't that correct?
What I'm looking for is correspondence in individual characteristics. I'll leave it there for now.
Right, you look at one, and then you look at the other one, and then you think, do they look similar, right?
What I'm doing to most accurately describe an identification, when a tool leaves a mark on an object, it can be what it is unique to the tool that left the mark. As part of my training, that 12 months of full-time training with FDLE, what I did is got familiar with known matching patterns.
Responsive.
What I'm getting familiar with is known matching patterns and known non-matching patterns under a comparison microscope, so that I know what known matching patterns look like, and I know what the best random agreement might look like in known non-matching patterns. In making an identification, looking at two items one to another under the microscope, what I'm saying is that the pattern I'm seeing under the microscope is consistent with known matching patterns and is significantly better than a known non-matching pattern.
So all those words together, you personally look at one and you look at the other, and you determine subjectively whether or not they look similar.
Objection asked and answered.
Yes, that's what I'm doing. The conclusion
So
that I
all of that you just said can be summed up in a one simple question about whether you look at one and look at the other and whether they look similar or not. Is that correct? Because you just said yes.
I felt that to describe similar, I wanted to give my definition for similar.
Right, but your previous response to my question was yes, that it is subjectively looking at one and then looking at the other and determining to yourself whether they appear similar. Is that correct?
That's correct.
That's what I thought. So even according to your own methods in this case, you were not able to eliminate the Glock 17 found on scene, correct?
That is correct.
So according to your own methods, the Glock 17 found on the scene could have fired the bullets found on scene, according to your own methods. Is that correct?
It could have, however, I believe it's unlikely.
Right, because you were not able to eliminate it. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, millions of guns are produced in this country each year that are chambered in 9mm that have polygonal rifling. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
Now, the types of firearms that have 9mm pistols and polygonal rifling come from such manufacturers as Bersa, Glock, H&K, Car Arms, Walther, and many others. Is that correct?
Not many others, but those are the main manufacturers that I'm aware of.
Your report says among others. It doesn't say many others, but it says among others. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
And the Glock 17 is a 9mm pistol with polygonal rifling. Isn't that true?
Yes.
Now, you were never given a Jericho pistol in this case to evaluate. Isn't that correct?
That is also correct.
And when you were doing these, looking at one and looking at the other tests, you weren't given a Jericho pistol to evaluate, isn't that correct?
Yes.
In fact, a Jericho pistol was never even mentioned when you were performing these tests, correct?
That is also correct.
And it wasn't even mentioned until very recently, isn't that correct? To you,
To me,
correct?
I've always known that Jericho pistols have polygonal barrels.
Right, but you weren't told about any possibility of a Jericho pistol in this case until very recently, isn't that correct?
It would be recent, yes, I understand.
Very recent, isn't that correct?
Define very recently for me, please.
How soon were you told?
It was approximately a couple months ago.
Okay. No further questions.
Any redirect?
So based on your review of the projectiles located or submitted to you by the sheriff's office, that you eliminated those projectiles as coming from the M&P 9mm,
Yes.
and you find it very unlikely that those projectiles were fired from the Glock 17 that was submitted to you for review as well.
I would say it's unlikely, yes.
No further questions.
Members of the jury, any questions? Write them down. All right. And we may have to get some of the exhibits ready as well, which I believe Deputy Bradley just started to put away. So if you could take them back out, please. Yes, please. That was premature. I'm going to ask you the first question, though. Why can't the projectiles be eliminated to number 58? I don't know which exhibit number 58 is.
58 for the record is the Glock 17 semi-automatic firearm.
Okay. So why can't the projectiles be eliminated to number 58?
That's a very good question. The reason I can't eliminate these bullets to the Glock pistol is that the evidence bullets are largely absent of individual characteristics. There are ways that a bullet can receive an absence of individual characteristics. Could a barrel have been dirty? Could it have been damaged by striking an object, overmarking or obliterating those individual characteristics? Those are variables that I can't account for. Absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, essentially. So in comparing these bullets to the gun, there are much fewer markings, whereas the test-fired bullets from the Glock do have a lot of markings on them, but because I can't account for all of the variables present, I can't conclusively state that they were not fired from that Glock pistol.
Okay. Please clarify the polygonal markings on the casings and projectiles versus the handguns. That was confusing. Exhibit number 58. Polygonal?
58 is the Glock 17.
So, could you repeat the question one more time?
Please clarify polygonal markings on casings and projectiles versus the handguns. And there's basically a list of all the exhibits asking the question. So start with Exhibit 58, which was the Glock 17, I believe.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. So number 58 first.
So 58, the barrel has polygonal rifling in it. What this means is that when the bullet passes down that barrel, the bullet's going to receive markings that are consistent in appearance with having been fired in a polygonal barrel. That's just the projectile by itself. The cartridge cases, on the other hand, while they come into contact with the barrel, rifling actually has nothing to do with a fired cartridge case. I have to use a different series of markings for the cartridge cases. So the bullets, they're consistent with having been fired in a barrel with polygonal rifling. The cartridge cases actually don't have anything to do with that polygonal rifling that I'm discussing.
All right. And so that answered as to the casings. Then number 94, what is exhibit number 94?
Before
Is that a gun?
94 is the Smith & Wesson M&P shield.
So with the M&P shield that we have there, the barrel in that is conventionally rifled. So comparing the projectiles, they look like they were fired from a polygonally rifled barrel. They could not have been fired from the Smith & Wesson. The barrel manufacturing method isn't the same. But looking at the cartridge cases, the markings that I used on those cartridge cases don't have anything to do with polygonal rifling. I used the markings on the side of the cartridge case wall to identify those cartridge cases as having been fired in that Smith & Wesson. So the cartridge cases, I believe, were fired in that Smith & Wesson. The bullets could not have been.
And number 132?
.132 is the Glock 26 located in the safe.
This, it falls under the same set of criteria as that first Glock that I described. It has a polygonally rifled barrel, which is similar to the class characteristics of those bullets, but I reached the same conclusion, that of negative inconclusive. I couldn't conclusively eliminate, however, I think it's unlikely those bullets were fired from that Glock. The cartridge cases, again, not having anything to do with a polygonal barrel, those cartridge cases were not fired in that Glock. I identified them to the Smith & Wesson pistol.
And then Jericho.
The Jericho, that's a pistol that we don't have here. The Jericho pistol, by design from the factory, comes with a polygonally rifled barrel.
If you have a crime scene where you collect a firearm, 4 shells and cartridges, 4 projectiles/bullets, and the shells/cartridges can be scientifically linked to the firearm, but the bullets/projectiles cannot be linked to the firearm, is the rifling inside the barrel the only factor that excludes the shell/projectile?
That's a difficult question to ask, to answer, I should say. I think probably the simplest way to be able to state it would be those bullets, they're eliminated from the Smith & Wesson because they have polygonal rifling on them. They could not have been fired in that gun. So you have one firearm represented by the cartridge cases. Those cartridge cases were fired in the Smith & Wesson. The projectiles here represent at least one unknown firearm being here. Bullets, they were not fired from the Smith & Wesson. The cartridge cases were. So I think in the simplest terms, that's saying that at least 2 different firearms are represented here. I think that's the most that I can say.
The projectiles found, were they range bullets or another type?
Range is, that's a good question. What these are, they're full metal jacket. Range ammunition is typically associated with full metal jacket, meaning not jacketed hollow points. So if range, meaning full metal jacket, is range, I would agree that with that term that the full metal jacket's consistent with this range type bullet.
How can you tell the difference, if any, between projectiles after they are shot, meaning the type of ammo?
Can you ask that one more time? I'm not sure if we're talking about projectiles or cartridge cases.
How can you tell the difference, if any, between the projectiles after shot, meaning the type of ammo?
The different types of ammo that you could determine are based on the bullet style. As the last question alluded to, these are full metal jacket bullets. That's just a design type. They're all the same caliber. They have the same class characteristics. So they have similar class characteristics, meaning can't differentiate them. The type of cartridge they were fired in, though, that's not something that I can conclusively state. I can say that they're consistent with having come from a 9mm Luger caliber cartridge. That's based on its design features. They're all approximately 115 grains. They measure approximately 0.355 inches in diameter, and they're a full metal jacket bullet. These are all things that are consistent with having been fired from a 9mm Luger caliber cartridge.
Any more questions based on those questions?
Just one, Your Honor. The comparisons that you made with regard to the M&P pistol, and that, for the record, is Exhibit 94. that firearm came to you as submitted from the sheriff's office. Is that correct?
Yes,
And the comparisons of the type of rifling that that firearm produces is based on your independent testing. Is it based on your independent testing of that firearm when it came to you?
it is. It's a conventionally rifled barrel. I determined that by looking at the barrel myself and examining it.
So had there been any changes to it, your analysis would have picked up on that as far as the barreling?
Yes.
I don't have any further questions.
Any recross?
None, Judge.
All right. Any more questions from members of the jury? May this witness be excused and released.
Yes, ma'am.
All right, thank you very much, sir. You're excused and you're released from your subpoena. All right, state may call their next witness.
Edgar Perez, Your Honor.
You solemnly swear or affirm that testimony you're about to give will be the complete truth, so help you God. I do. Thank you.
Have a seat, please. Yes, please do.
Good morning, how are you?
Good morning. Well, and yourself?
Good, thank you. Please tell us your name.
My name is Edgar Perez.
Spell your first and last name.
Yes, it would be spelled E-D-G-A-R. Last name is P-E-R-E-Z.
What do you do for an occupation?
So I'm employed at the Florida Department of Law Enforcement at the Orlando Regional Operations Center within the Biology and DNA section.
And how long have you been with and I'll refer to it as FDLE. How long have you been with FDLE?
Approximately 12 years.
You said you were in the biology section?
Yes, that's correct.
How long have you been in the biology section?
The entire time.
Tell the jury, what does the biology section do? Give us a sense of the various jobs or things that you do in the biology section.
Yeah, so as a crime laboratory analyst, I'm tasked with looking at items of evidence in search for body fluids such as blood, semen, and saliva, which are good sources of DNA. Once I'm able to locate those sources of DNA, I take those samples forward through the DNA process to generate a DNA profile, which will allow me to either include or exclude an individual as a donor to that stain.
Tell the jury your educational background, please.
I have 3 Bachelor's of Science degrees from the University of Central Florida, 1 in chemistry, 1 in biology, and 1 in molecular microbiology. I also have a Master's of Science degree from the University of Florida in pharmaceutical sciences with a focus on forensic DNA and serology, and also a graduate certificate in forensic death investigation.
After your education, tell the jury, please, your professional work experience.
Yeah, so to become a crime laboratory analyst, I had to undergo an approximately year-long training program at FDLE, which is broken down into 2 phases. The first phase is very similar to school. I would work on a lot of mock samples and take numerous examinations and perform a lot of readings and oral assessments. The second phase, I would go into what is known as supervised casework, where I would work alongside a trained analyst, working real evidence in order to get the skills necessary to perform my duties. And that second phase culminated in a mock trial.
Tell the jury your training, education, and experience in the field of human DNA testing. You kind of gave us an overview, and now can you just be a little more specific and tell us your training, education, and experience in the field of human DNA testing?
Yeah, so in the field of human DNA testing, my entire graduate studies were all focused on forensic serology and DNA, which is the identification of DNA within samples for human identification. Part of my undergraduate education was focused on the molecular biology techniques that are utilized to be able to generate these DNA profiles. And the training at FDLE was completely focused on the day-to-day operations and everything that I would be doing as a crime laboratory analyst.
Can you give us some sense over the years that you've been with FDLE, the number of human DNA tests that you've conducted?
I've performed thousands of DNA analyses.
Have you previously testified as an expert in the field of human DNA testing?
Yes, I have.
And once again, can you tell us approximately how many times?
Approximately 24 times.
Now, Do you undergo what are called proficiency testing at FDLE?
Yes, I do.
Tell the jury about that. Tell the jury, first of all, what is a proficiency test, and just give us a sense of how that's done, the number of tests, how often it's given.
Yeah, so proficiency test is an examination that's administered from an outside agency. It's basically brought into the laboratory. I'm aware that it's an exam, and I work it just like I would a case. So I process it alongside samples and take it through the entire DNA process just like I would any other case that I'm working. The results are unknown to me or the agency, so once I do generate DNA results for that test, it is sent out. The agency that performs this is called Collaborative Testing Services. And what they do is they verify the results and they send it back to FDLE, where a final verdict is determined as to whether or not I passed or failed.
How often do you take proficiency tests?
I take it every 6 months.
And how have you done with your proficiency testing?
I've passed every one of them.
Now, let me ask you some questions concerning the quality assurance at the laboratory, and particularly the biology section. First of all, in general, what is quality assurance? What does that mean?
So quality assurance is the plan that the laboratory has in place to establish and ensure the integrity of all the samples and the results that are obtained from those samples, such that members of the legal community, the law enforcement community, and you as civilians have faith in the results that are brought forth by the laboratory.
I'm going to ask you some more detailed questions about quality assurance, but first let me ask you, what does contamination mean?
So contamination is the introduction of DNA that was not intended to be within the sample initially. It could occur from the person that's working on the evidence to the sample. It could occur from a sample to a sample, or from the environment onto a sample.
What particular steps do you take in your biology section to prevent contamination? And I'm referring to contamination from one item of evidence to another item of evidence, or from the analyst who is conducting the testing, from the analyst to an item of evidence.
Certainly. So as the analyst, I would be protecting myself and the evidence from me by wearing personal protective equipment. This includes a laboratory coat or gown, a face mask, and gloves. If I'm also working with liquid substances, I could wear a face shield to prevent them from getting into my eyes. That protects the evidence from getting contaminated from my own DNA source. Now, if I'm trying to prevent the evidence from being contaminated by the environment, the surfaces that I work on are decontaminated with a solution, and then they're cleaned down. A piece of clean butcher paper is laid down on that surface so the evidence doesn't come in contact with it at any time. This area is disinfected with each piece of evidence that I'm working, and such that only one piece of evidence is opened at any given time and worked at that time. To protect the samples from cross-contamination, I use single-use tools that are discarded, or those tools are sterilized through a very rigorous process. And also, the samples go into independent tubes that are closed, so they're not exposed to the presence of other samples or myself.
Tell the jury, what are controls, positive controls and negative controls?
So controls are samples that are included alongside the test to verify that the chemistry that you are performing is working, or to ensure that there is no contamination alongside those samples.
What is a positive control?
So a positive control is one that gives an expected result. So if I'm testing for blood, it's one that would give the color change test for blood as a positive indication that it could be blood. If I'm working with DNA, it's a known DNA profile that I could verify of the correct origin.
And what is a negative control?
So a negative control would be blank. I would expect no chemical reaction from that, and I would also expect no DNA profile from it.
Now, what about the security, evidence security and storage at your lab, in particular the biology section? Can you give the jury a description of that, please? Or would you?
Yes, so all evidence that's brought to FDLE is brought in through the evidence intake section, at which point it is transferred to a crime laboratory technician who places that piece of evidence into the laboratory information management system, assigns it a barcode label, and it is then placed into the vault. Once an analyst is assigned a case to be worked, the analyst will request that evidence from the evidence intake section, and the crime laboratory technician will transfer that evidence to the analyst, who will then take it to their work area, where each analyst has a secured and locked locker where those evidence pieces will be kept until they are worked by the analyst. Once the case is completed and logged off, the analyst will then take the pieces of evidence back to the evidence intake section to be placed in the vault until a contributing agency can come back and retrieve it.
Now, what about accreditations and certifications? Can you tell the jury if the laboratory, and in particular the biology section, holds any type of certifications and accreditations?
Yes, the laboratory is accredited by the American National Standards Institute National Accreditation Board under the FBI, or Federal Bureau of Investigation, Quality Assurance Standards for DNA Analysis Methods, and the International Organization for Standardization Standard 17025.
Audits. Tell the jury, first of all, what is an audit, and if any audits are conducted on the laboratory, and once again, particularly the biology section.
So an audit is essentially a top-to-bottom inspection of the laboratory for all of the operations and the procedures that are contained, including surveying the members of the laboratory for their education, the security of the building, the evidence retention and control, the processing of samples, the review of testimony, the review of case files, the way that the controls are measured and tested, lot numbers, everything you can imagine that would go forward in a crime laboratory analyst would be scrutinized by these accrediting agencies that come in. We do perform audits internally, meaning FDLE members will go and survey the FDLE labs themselves once every other year. Opposite years, we will have an external agency come in and survey the laboratory. Every 4 years, we will have a formal inspection from the accrediting body, which is the massive audit.
And what are the results of those audits have been?
Since we have been formally reaccredited every single time, we have successfully completed all the inspections.
Now, tell the jury what is DNA?
So DNA is an acronym, stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. It's basically the genetic blueprint that makes you who you are. So you get half of it from your mom and you get half from your dad, and that's what makes you unique. In fact, there's no two people in the world that would have your DNA except for potentially identical twins. Now it's found in virtually every single cell of your body, and it's the same from when you're born to the point when you die. So that makes it a useful forensic tool for identifying individuals.
And in what substances is DNA contained?
You could find DNA in virtually every cell, so you could have it in blood, you could have it in semen, you could have it in saliva, you could have it in hairs, skin cells.
And is DNA testing used in fields outside the forensic or courtroom setting?
Yes, so beyond forensics, we can use DNA to figure out if you have hereditary illnesses and medical diagnostics. You could use it for identification of human remains in mass disasters. You could use it for developing population studies and migration patterns throughout the world.
And what particular DNA method or testing does your section use, your laboratory use?
So the laboratory uses what's known as STR, or short tandem repeat testing. Basically what this does is it doesn't look at the entire DNA strand, because that would take a lot of money and a lot of time to do. But what it looks for is very unique repeating segments within the DNA that are very specific to each individual. And that's what we leverage to be able to do the comparisons.
And tell the jury, what, in the context of DNA testing, what is a locus?
So a locus is a scientific term for the location that I'm looking at on the DNA. So like I said, I don't look at the entire DNA, I'm looking at specific areas. So when I say locus or locus is mentioned, I'm talking about the location.
Now, the particular type of testing that you do, the STR testing, does that test at a specific identified loci, which is the plural of locus?
Yes, that's correct.
And the particular type of testing that you do in your laboratory, and in this particular case, how many loci are tested, or locations tested?
There would be 21 regions that are looked at to do statistical comparison, but overall there's 24 locations.
Now, I'm in a moment going to ask you to describe step by step each individual part of the process, but first let me ask you this question. What does PCR mean, and specifically in the context of PCR, STR, DNA testing? What does PCR mean?
So PCR is also an acronym. It stands for polymerase chain reaction. It's a scientific process that I would consider very similar to making photocopying of a piece of paper. Instead, I'm making photocopies of the DNA. So it's a molecular Xerox process where I'm making millions of copies of a fragment of DNA in order for the instruments to be able to detect it.
Now, let me ask you, please tell the jury each individual step of the DNA testing process. You have a particular sample, you want to test it. Describe each step in the process that you use.
Yes. So the first step would be to take a small cutting or a piece of the sample forward of the stain. I would apply heat and chemicals in order to get the DNA out of that sample. Since these are all question stains, meaning I don't know how much DNA is in there, I have to go through a process of figuring out the quantity of DNA in the sample, because I use very specific processes and chemicals that are targeted to create specific amounts of DNA. Once I know how much DNA is in the sample, I could go through that molecular Xeroxing process, the PCR, to make millions of copies of the samples, and then I put it through a genetic analyzer, which is able to generate a DNA profile.
And in a nutshell, is that known as extraction, quantitation, and amplification?
Yes, that's correct.
And tell the jury what type of test results that you can get from a sample. And what I'm asking is, describe to the jury a complete profile versus a partial profile and a mixture. Just describe and explain to the jury those type of results and what they mean.
So the best result you could get would be a complete single source profile. And so when I explain to you that DNA, you get half of it from your mom and you get half from your dad, that means that you're going to have 2 copies at each location. If your mom and your dad gave you the same copy, it's going to make it look like you only got 1. But overall, I'm expecting 1 or 2 pieces of information at all of those 21 locations that I'm doing for comparison. That's a complete single source profile. A partial would be one that doesn't have 1 or 2 pieces of information at those 21 locations, meaning that you're missing something somewhere. And so it's incomplete or it's partial. When you're looking at a mixture, that's when you have more than 2 pieces of information present, meaning that there is the possibility now that multiple people have contributed DNA to that sample. So if I would be looking at those 21 locations, I would expect more than 3 pieces of information present.
And explain to the jury what would be the reasons to get a partial profile.
So that could vary based on the sample and how much DNA was deposited from an individual. Typically, blood tends to be a good source, so if you have a concentrated blood sample, I would expect to get a complete DNA profile, assuming that the blood is only coming from one individual. If the blood is mixed with 2 people, then I could get a mixture. If the blood is degraded, or let's say that the person just barely touched the surface and didn't leave a lot of skin cells behind, that's one circumstance where you could get a partial DNA profile, or you may get such limited results that they're not even interpretable, meaning I can't figure out who that person is in that sample.
Is it possible for a DNA profile, because of degradation or whatever factor may apply or whatever reason, for a DNA profile to change to another DNA profile?
No, DNA is consistent your entire life, so your DNA is not going to change for any reason.
And when you have a specific mixture, what types of conclusions, possible conclusions, can you make from a mixture?
Well, we could have a mixture that could be based on a certain number of people, in which case I could try to make a determination as to who the individuals are within a mixture. You could have mixtures that are too complicated, meaning that there are more than 4 people in the mixture, and therefore they're too complex. It's similar to a puzzle, where you have just too many pieces put in there from multiple puzzles thrown into a box, and you really can't put that puzzle together. So that's the best way of thinking of that. Or you could,
I'm sorry, did you finish?
well, you could also have a mixture that's degraded, meaning that a lot of the information is missing from multiple areas, which makes it difficult to interpret.
With regard to a mixture, tell the jury, what does an inclusion mean, what does an exclusion mean, and what is inconclusive? And you kind of, I think, just touched upon that, but explain to the jury what that means, inclusion, exclusion, or inconclusive.
So the exclusion means that when I looked at somebody's reference profile or their standard, their DNA profile is not represented in that mixture. So I was able to remove them from it and basically say they're not present and they're a contributor to that mixture. If a person is included, it means that their DNA profile is represented within the mixture that I see. And at that point, it would go through statistical software to be able to perform the likelihood ratio calculation of inclusion. If a person is in the situation of a no determination, it means that they're in a very gray zone. In the laboratory, we determine that there's an inconclusive zone, meaning that there's not sufficient statistical support to include the person or exclude them. And basically what that means is I can see the person potentially being in the mixture, but because I cannot statistically generate a number for that inclusion, I cannot conclusively say that they're there.
Tell the jury, please, what is a standard or a known sample of DNA?
So a standard is a reference profile that's collected typically with a cotton tip swab of the inside of a person's mouth. Since the skin cells in there are highly regenerative, it's easy to get a complete DNA profile from that person.
And a standard is typically collected from a known individual to be compared to what are called evidentiary samples or items of evidence?
Yes, that's correct.
Now, Mr. Perez, simply because a person touches an item, does that mean that they're going to leave their DNA on that item?
Not necessarily. Your hands have skin cells, which could be sloughed off and left on a surface. That depends on a lot of variables. Most importantly, what kind of a surface are you touching? If it's a smooth surface, there's less of a likelihood that you're going to leave DNA behind. But if it's textured, those little grooves and pockets are great areas for the DNA to get embedded. Furthermore, if you only touch a surface once, there's a very low likelihood that you're going to leave a complete DNA profile behind. You may leave some traces, or you may not leave any at all. But I would not expect to see a complete DNA profile from somebody who just casually touches a surface at one time. Now, if you're constantly handling an object, that gives you more contact with that surface, which gives greater increased amount of epithelial cell or skin cell transfer into that surface. So I would expect better results from that sample. The best would be if you're wearing something. Because you're wearing something, it's constantly rubbing up on your body, and you have a very, very high likelihood of leaving skin cells on that garment at that point.
And you kind of anticipated my next question. What you just described to the jury, would that be known as touch DNA versus handler DNA versus wearer DNA?
Yes, that's correct.
And simply by touching an item, that's out of the spectrum, that would be the lowest likelihood of leaving any type of DNA on that item?
Yes, touching would be the lowest, and if the individual is wearing gloves or some object between the surface and their hand, then I would not expect them to deposit DNA.
And how would you define, and I know that you touched upon this a few moments ago, but how would you define handler DNA then?
So handler would be like the pen that most of you are touching right now to take notes. You've probably been using the same pen for the entirety of the trial, and so your skin cells are probably on the surface of that, versus you maybe touching the door as you're opening the juror box. If you only do that once versus a pen which you're touching repeatedly. Those are two differences.
And tell the jury what is wearer DNA?
So wearer would be clearly the clothing that you're wearing right now, the armpit region and the collar region of the shirts. are constantly wearing against your neck and the armpits, so those are going to be great sources of skin cell transfer.
Now, when a person is excluded, and I'm using the term excluded or exclusion, when a person is excluded as a contributor to a DNA profile that's found on a particular object, does that mean that that person did not touch that object?
Not necessarily. It just means that the DNA was not deposited on the object.
Now, let me ask you some questions about statistics. Once you identify a DNA profile on an evidentiary, item of evidence, and you've also identified a profile on a known standard that you've tested, at that point, is the known standard, the profile identified on the known standard, compared to the profile that has been identified on the evidentiary or the item of evidence?
Yes, I would do a match to that sample if they are consistent with each other.
If the DNA profile that's identified on a known standard, when you compare it to the profile identified on an item of evidence, if it is different at even just one locus, what significance does that have to you?
Well, if I'm looking at a single source profile, meaning I have complete information in a profile, if there is a discrepancy at one location, that could be an exclusion right there.
With regard to a single source, you mentioned, you used that term. When you compare the DNA profile that's identified on a known standard to a profile that has been identified on an evidentiary standard, or item of evidence, and they match, they're the same, then what does that tell you?
So I would report it as a match, and I would go ahead and perform a statistical calculation for that match.
Which anticipates my next question. Tell the jury the statistical, well, first let me ask, what is the purpose? Why at that point, when you have a match, do you then go on to the next step of engaging in a statistical calculation?
Yes, so for me to say that somebody matches is one thing. For me to give you a number, a numerical assessment of that match, it gives you the strength behind that association. There could be matches that are weaker, and there could be matches that are stronger. So in order for you as a jury to make an informed decision as to how relevant or valid that match is, I have to provide you a statistical analysis alongside the match.
And as part of that, well, let me back up and ask you, is that statistical calculation performed in cases of both where you have a single source DNA and a mixture of DNA?
Yes, the calculations will be performed in both situations.
And as part of this statistical calculation, do you use what is called a database?
Yes, I do use a population database.
And tell the jury, what is a database, and why is it used in your statistical, in your calculations and in your statistical process?
Yes, so a database is essentially a collection of pieces of information in order to determine how common or how rare those pieces of information are. Best way for you to think about it is if I was to give you 1,000 bags of M&Ms and you were to break all of them open, if you were to count out your blue ones and your brown ones and your yellow ones, you would figure out how common or how rare each color is. because we all know that you don't get the same amount of each color in each bag. It works the same way for human DNA. So when you have a certain number of samples, you can count how common or how rare each one of the little pieces of DNA information that I'm looking at is. And so that rarity is used to determine the overall commonality or rareness of a DNA profile for an individual.
Now, in this particular case, what database did you use?
So the database that was used was from the National Institutes of Standards and Technology.
And are you familiar with the database? And if so, how are you familiar with the database?
Yes, we have been using the database for quite some time. The database was compiled by the group of Hill, this is the scientist's last name, at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, and is composed of approximately 1,000 samples from 3 different ethnicities: Caucasian, Southeastern Hispanic, and African American. And so these samples were from self-reported ethnicities. Basically, they were collected from Millennium Biotech, Interstate Blood Banks, and DNA Diagnostics. Those samples, the DNA profiles were generated from them, and they calculated how many times they basically saw each of the pieces of information. And from that, they were able to determine how common or how rare each one of those pieces was. They put this information into a table, and that information is used when I do the statistical calculations and the software to figure out how rare or how common a DNA profile is.
And in the field of forensic DNA testing is the use of databases, and this case in particular, the database that you used, is it considered to be accepted and generally reliable within the field?
Yes, it is. It's used by multiple laboratories, in fact, and the database itself has been published in the Journal of Forensic Science International Genetics, and it's been peer-reviewed.
The product rule. First, let me ask you, what is the product rule, and is it used as part of your statistical calculation, and why?
So yes, within the software, it does utilize an aspect of what is known as a product rule. It's a mathematical proposition. Basically, what it's stating is that if I am looking at your overall DNA profile, in order for me to figure out how rare or common you are as a person, meaning all 21 locations, I can multiply each one of those 21 locations against each other, because each one of those locations has its own independent rarity of itself, meaning that whatever you have as your DNA in location 1 has no relevance on what you would have in location 2, 3, 4 through 21. Because they're all independent, I can multiply each one of those and get an overall rarity of your profile.
And once again, let me ask you the same question with regard to the product rule. Is the use of the product rule considered to be generally accepted and reliable within the field of forensic DNA testing?
Yes, it is.
What is a statistical likelihood ratio?
So statistical likelihood ratio is the way that the statistic is presented at FDLE. Basically, in its most general form, a likelihood ratio is the way that you form a ratio is by having 2 different ideas and you stack them against each other. And for example, before you have the prosecution, you have the defense, and each one has an idea as to what would be expected from that sample. The prosecution would like the defendant to be present in a sample. The defense would like the defendant to not be present in the sample. So what a likelihood ratio does is it says, given the evidence, it provides how likely it is that one of those ideas has more value than the other.
And you've told us that you've testified, I believe you mentioned 24 times regarding forensic DNA testing. How many times have you testified regarding the statistical component of DNA testing?
So in most of the cases that I've testified have included statistics.
And I'm going to get to the case results in this particular case, but briefly tell the jury your training and experience in statistics.
Yeah, so I had numerous classes in my undergraduate studies as well in my graduate coursework. I also underwent training modules at FDLE as they pertain to the statistics that are performed in casework. And I went through different conferences where they have workshops as to how to perform the statistical analysis and utilization of the software, as well as external trainings that were provided by the individuals who created the statistical software suite.
I'm showing council what's been marked for identification. Judge, can we approach, please? May I approach, Your Honor, please, the witness? Let me show you what's already been introduced into evidence, State's Exhibit 205, and ask you if you recognize that.
I do.
And how do you recognize it?
By my agency barcode and my initials.
And let me show you what's been marked for identification. State's Exhibit 12R, 12S, and 12T. Ask you to please look at those items of evidence.
I also recognize them.
And how do you recognize them?
They also bear the agency barcode label and my initials and information on it.
Now, did you conduct the DNA testing on those particular items?
I did.
And specifically with regard, well, first let me back up and ask you, what is a bloodstain card?
So a bloodstain card is typically generated at the medical examiner's office from a deceased individual's blood. It's just a card with four, basically it's cotton pads on it, circles, and they would draw some of the blood from the individual's body and place it onto these circles. Basically, those cotton fibers have a material that preserves the DNA profile from the blood since the person's already deceased and it could potentially degrade. And it allows it for it to be collected and sent to a laboratory also for long-term preservation of that blood.
And in this particular case, did you prepare bloodstain cards with regard to the three items that are marked for identification?
No, they were submitted as such.
So you received that from the medical examiner's office?
I believe they came from the Seminole County Sheriff's Office directly.
Oh, okay. Now, did you conduct DNA testing on each one of those items? The item that's already been introduced into evidence and the three that have been marked for identification?
Yes, I did.
And did you use the procedure that you described earlier in your testimony?
I did.
Were you able to obtain a full DNA profile?
Yes, I was able to obtain complete DNA profiles for those samples.
Okay. Your Honor, at this point, I'd offer into evidence the three items that are marked for identification.
No objection, Your Honor.
Pre-marked for identification as State's Exhibit 12R will be moved into evidence as State's Exhibit 317 in evidence. What's been pre-marked for identification as State's Exhibit 12S will be moved into evidence as State's Exhibit 318 in evidence. What's been pre-marked for identification as 12T will be moved into evidence as State's Exhibit 319 in evidence.
Now, let me show you another item. Let me show you what's been introduced and already been introduced into evidence, State's Exhibit 204. Ask you to look at that. Do you recognize that?
Yes, I do.
And how do you recognize State's 204?
Again, by the barcode label from the agency, including my markings on the evidence.
Now, with regard to what State's Exhibit 204, and for the benefit of the jury, what is 204? What is it described on the envelope?
This is one swab from the inside cuff area of a pair of black leather gloves.
Now, with regard to the swabbing that's contained within 204, did you conduct a DNA testing?
Yes, I did.
And were you able to obtain a result?
Yes, so this particular sample demonstrated a mixture with 4 donors.
And did you do a comparison of the known sample that you tested? I'm referring specifically to State's Exhibit 205, which is represented as being a buccal swab from Grant Amato. Did you do a comparison of the results that you obtained on the swabbing of the leather cuffs, the cuffs of the leather gloves, when you compared it to the results that you obtained with regard to the testing of the buccal swab of? Did you also receive an item that was designated as AR2C?
I did.
And what was that designated to you as being?
That was a swab from the end of the barrel.
Of the AR2 gun?
Yes.
And what results did you obtain from your testing with regard to that particular swab?
That sample showed that there were limited DNA results, which were not interpretable.
For your reference and convenience, I'm referring to your June 20th, 2019 report. Did you receive an item that was designated to you as AR7A?
I did.
And tell the jury what was or what is AR7A designated as being.
It was a swab from the grip, trigger, and slide of AR7.
And what is the slide of a gun?
Well, my expertise is in DNA, not in firearms necessarily. I can make a conjecture as to what the slide would be.
All right, well, have you tested that before? Have you tested swabs of slides of guns?
Yes, I have.
Okay, and then based upon that experience, do you know what the swab, what a slide of a gun is?
Yes, it would be the top portion.
I'm sorry?
The top portion of the gun
Okay. The portion of the gun that actually
slides
back?
backwards, yes.
Okay. Now, with regard to that particular swab, I'm referring once again to AR-7A. What results did you obtain?
So that particular exhibit, AR-7A, demonstrated the presence of a mixture consistent with 2 donors.
And specifically with regard to Chad Amato, what were the results that you obtained?
So Chad was included as a possible contributor to the mixture, and that mixture is greater than 700 billion times more likely if it originated from Chad and 1 unrelated individual than from 2 unrelated individuals.
And with regard to Cody Amato, what results did you obtain?
So Cody was excluded as a contributor.
And with regard to Margaret Amato?
Margaret was also excluded.
And with regard to Grant Amato?
And Grant was also excluded.
Now, did you receive an item that was designated as AR-7B?
I did.
And also AR-7C?
Yes.
And first, tell the jury, what is AR-7B designated as being?
That's a swab from the front and rear sights of AR-7.
And specifically, what is AR-7C designated as being?
It's a swab from the end of the barrel of AR-7.
And what results did you obtain from your DNA testing?
So both of these samples gave results that were too limited to interpret.
And again, because this is very confusing subject matter, what does that mean? Can you tell the jury what that means, please?
Yes, in order for me to make any determination as to if somebody could be potentially included or excluded from a sample, I expect a certain level of DNA to be present. And in these samples, the DNA was so limited, meaning it's so sparse and basically non-present, that I could not conclusively make any determination as to how many people could be in that sample, if it was from one person, or if that person could even be there.
Now, Mr. Perez, for your reference and convenience, I'm referring now to your June 28th report. And specifically, did you receive, and I'm going to name them off quickly and then I'll go through them one by one, but specifically, did you receive items designated as EB5, EB6, EB7, and EB8?
Yes, I did.
And tell us, what is EB5 designated as being?
So that EB5 is the scrub bottoms from Grant Amato.
What is EB6 designated as being?
That would be the scrub top from Grant Amato.
And were there sub-designations EB6A and EB6B?
Yes, it was broken down into 2 separate exhibits because there was tissue paper that was found. So the tissue paper was labeled as EB6B, and the scrub top was EB6A.
EB7, what was that or is that designated as being?
That's underwear from Grant Amato.
And EB8, what was that designated as being?
It was a white shirt from Grant Amato.
And specifically, with regard to those items, what type of, what were the results of your DNA testing?
I was not able to locate any stains for serological testing, so the exhibits were not processed any further from there.
Did you receive, and once again, I'm going to name off some items of evidence quickly, and then I'll go through them one by one, but did you receive items designated as AR-11, AR-44, EB9, and EB13?
Yes, I did.
Specifically, AR-11, were they sub-designated?
Yes, there were. That was a pair of leather gloves. So the left glove was designated as AR-11A, and the right glove was designated AR-11B.
AR-44, what was that designated as being?
That was a piece of paper towel with an unknown dark stain.
EB9.
So those were
Was that
shoes-
sub-designated? I'm sorry.
Yes, it was. So those were shoes from Amato, so they were also sub-designated as EB9A for the left shoe and EB9B for the right shoe.
And EB13, what was that designated as being?
Those are a pair of jeans from Amato.
Now, I'm going to ask you for your results in a second, but among those items that we're discussing now, there's the AR-11, the black leather gloves that we previously talked about. Are those the same black leather gloves that you received swabbings from the inner cuffs to do DNA testing?
Yes, they bear the same designation.
Okay. But now you received that item back among the others that I named to you to do a serological testing?
That's correct.
And specifically, what did you test for with regard to those particular items?
So I was looking for the presence of blood within these items, and I used the color change test, the chemical color change test in the laboratory to be able to determine if there was blood on the surface or not.
And what were the results of that testing?
So exhibits AR11A, AR11B, AR44, EB9A, EB9B, and EB13 all failed to give chemical indications for the presence of blood.
And so consequently, no DNA testing was conducted on those?
That's correct.
Now, did you receive an item of evidence that was designated as ME8?
I did.
And what is that designated as being?
It was a black leather belt from Amato.
And did you do, well, let me ask you, what type of testing did you do on that particular item, ME8?
So I performed the same chemical color change test that I did for blood for the other exhibits.
And what were the results of that?
So for exhibit ME8, stains A, B, C, and D, as well as the swabbing that I took testing for handler DNA from the item, all gave chemical indications for the presence of blood.
And that's something that you would expect to find if it was his belt. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, if an individual was bleeding, there's a possibility that the blood would seep down to the belt and cover the surface, and it would be their own profile.
Now, did you observe any DNA that was foreign to Chad Amato?
Now, from exhibit ME8, there was no DNA foreign to Amato on that exhibit.
And it's, once again, pretty self-explanatory. But explain to the jury, what does that mean, DNA foreign to something else?
So since I already have a reference profile from Chad, I can use that to figure out if there's any DNA in that exhibit that is not consistent with his own DNA. And so anything foreign would be any DNA that just does not belong to him. In this situation, there was none.
Now, did you receive an item of evidence designated as AR-13?
Yes, I did.
And what is AR-13 designated as being?
That was the holster from Chad Amato's belt.
And first of all, did you test that item for the presence of blood?
Yes, I did a chemical change test for the testing for blood, and that exhibit failed to give chemical indications for the presence of blood.
So you didn't observe or didn't get any results back indicating blood being on that holster?
No, I did not.
As far as the DNA, you conducted DNA testing on that item?
Yes, I did.
And first, tell us what the results were of that DNA. In other words, did you get a mixture or a single source?
Yes, this exhibit demonstrated the presence of a mixture. of 2 donors.
And what were the results with respect to Margaret Amato?
So Margaret was included as a possible contributor to the mixture, and the mixture is 88 million times more likely to occur if it originated from Margaret and 1 unrelated individual than from 2 unrelated individuals.
And what were the results with respect to Chad Amato?
So Chad was also included as a possible contributor to that mixture, and that mixture is greater than 700 billion times more likely if it originated from Chad Amato and 1 unrelated individual than from 2 unrelated individuals.
And what were the results with respect to Grant Amato and Cody Amato?
So Grant and Cody were excluded as contributors to the mixture.
And once again, an exclusion, what does an exclusion mean?
It means that their DNA was not represented within the mixture from what was seen.
An exclusion does not necessarily mean they did not touch the object. Is that a fair statement?
Not necessarily.
Now, did you receive an item that was designated as AR-21?
Yes, I did.
And what is AR-21 designated as being?
It's a black leather card holder from Chad Amato.
And first of all, did you test that particular item for the presence of blood?
I did, but it failed to give chemical indications for the presence of blood.
The DNA testing, did you conduct the DNA testing on that particular item?
I did, and it demonstrated the presence of a mixture with 2 donors.
And with regard to Margaret Amato, what were the results?
So Margaret was included as a possible contributor to this mixture, and the mixture is approximately 9.5 million times more likely if it originated from Margaret and 1 unrelated individual than from 2 unrelated individuals.
And what were the results with regard to Chad Amato?
So Chad was also included as a contributor to the mixture, and the mixture is greater than 700 billion times more likely if it originated from Chad and an unrelated individual than from 2 unrelated individuals.
What were the results with respect to Grant Amato and Cody Amato?
Grant and Cody were both excluded from this mixture.
And sorry to be repetitious, but once again, the exclusion does not mean that a person did not touch an item. Is that a fair statement?
It does not.
I'm almost done. Did you receive an item that's designated as AR-33?
I did.
And what is AR-33 designated as being?
That was a cell phone clip from Cody Amato's bag.
And conduct DNA testing on that item?
Yes, this item demonstrated the presence of a mixture consistent with 2 donors.
And specifically, what were the results with regard to Cody Amato?
So Cody was included as a possible contributor to that mixture, and the mixture is greater than 700 billion times more likely if it originated from Cody and 1 unrelated individual than from 2 unrelated individuals.
And specifically with regard to Grant Amato, Margaret Amato, and Chad Amato, what were the results?
Grant, Margaret, and Chad were all excluded from the sample.
And exclusion does not mean they did not touch it.
Not necessarily. I do have to make a correction to ME1, ME2, and ME3. I did create the bloodstain cards for those. They were not submitted, created.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Got one moment, Your Honor. I think I'm done, but let me just check. Hey, let me, actually, there is one more question I do want to ask you, and I'm referring for your reference to your June 28th report. And on the bottom of page 2, did you receive a item that was or is designated as AR-56A?
I did.
And what is AR-56A designated as being?
It was a swab from the handle and the clips of a gun box from Cody Amato's bedroom.
And did you conduct DNA testing on that item?
I did, but the results were too limited to interpret.
And you probably have during the course of your testimony, but tell the jury, please, again, what does that mean?
Means that there wasn't sufficient DNA present in that sample for me to make any interpretation at all as to anybody's contribution to it.
Okay, thank you. Did you ever hear of the expression that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence?
Yes, I have heard of it.
What does that mean?
With regards to forensic DNA,
Yeah.
it's basically the premise that if DNA results are not present, it does not have a bearing as to whether or not an individual ever came in contact with an item, because there is a possibility that you may not leave DNA behind when you do come in contact with an object. Just because you're not present in it, there's the possibility that you still could have come in contact with it.
Okay. I have no further questions.
Morning, Mr. Perez.
Good morning.
I know it was tedious, and I appreciate Mr. Stone's thorough examination of you. I just have a few questions for you, okay?
Okay.
Referencing the June 28th, 2019 laboratory report, in summation, you reviewed scrub bottoms from Grand Amato, scrub top from Grand Amato, tissue paper, underwear from Grand Amato, white shirt from Grand Amato, shoes from Grand Amato, left and right. And through your testing, you found no blood.
No, I did not.
Thank you. Now, I'd like to refer you to your other report of June, I think it's the 28th, or 29th, I'm sorry. AR-2A, that was the one swab, grip, trigger, and a slide of AR-2?
Yes.
Now, assuming 2 donors to the mixture of that, Grand Amato was excluded as a possible contributor.
That's correct.
Okay. But now when you, I don't want to say manipulate, but if you add a third donor to it, and that being Grand Amato, he could be a possible contributor?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. And you've heard of what's called touch DNA, correct?
Excuse me?
Touch DNA?
Oh, yes.
Okay. You made reference earlier on the direct examination that these jurors are using their pens, and they've probably been using them for a while. It would be fair to say that their DNA is on those pens?
I would expect the more
You would-
you handle an object, the greater the likelihood is of you being on an object, yes.
Okay. Now, hypothetically, let's say that one of the jurors lets you use their pen that they've been using,
Yes.
and you use that pen to write something down on a piece of paper. Now, assuming that we can't hear you very good, and the judge says, can you pull that microphone up to you? And you grab that microphone sort of like this, and then you start talking. Is it possible that the juror's DNA would be found on that microphone?
There is a possibility of transfer from the surface of the pen, because DNA can be carried by sources who are touching multiple objects. So yes, if I was to touch the pen with one of your DNA profiles on it, there is a possibility I could transfer it to the microphone.
And even though they had never touched that microphone, it's possible that their DNA would be on it.
Yes, I would not expect it to be in the same quantity, but there could be transfer that occurs.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Perez. No further questions, Judge.
Any redirect?
No, Your Honor.
Any questions, members of the jury? Write it down, please. Roach. All right, one of our jurors has a question for you. If we get half our DNA from the mother and half from the father, what or how can you tell siblings apart?
Yes. All right. So your mom and your dad both got half of their DNA from their mom and their dad, right? So that means that they have a unique set of 2 pieces of information at each location. When they go to give one piece of their DNA to the offspring, it's random as to which one of those 2 copies they get. So your brother and your sisters may get the same copy that you got from your mom, but another brother or sister may get the other copy at that same location from your mom. So it's just random how it happens when you're conceived, but one of those two pieces is going to be randomly given to that offspring at that location, and that's what promotes that variability between siblings, unless they're identical.
Any follow-up based on that question, Mr. Stone?
No, Your Honor.
Any follow-up based on that question, Mr. Dowd?
No, ma'am.
All right, any more questions from the members of the jury? All right, may this witness be excused and released.
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, thank you very much. You're excused and you're released from your subpoena. Let me ask, State, can you all approach? State may call their next witness. And for the record, I just wanted to make sure it was clear, because I don't know if it was announced, that 15L, 15M, 15N, 15O, and 15P were marked as 312, 313, 314, 315, and 316 in evidence. All right, Mr. Brothers, you're still under oath because you haven't been released from your subpoena, so please come forward, have a seat. State, you may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Ms. Brothers.
Morning.
During your cross-examination last week, you were asked about whether or not you swabbed the driver's side handle, the exterior driver's side handle of the car. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And do you recall what you stated in court about whether or not you swabbed the exterior handle for DNA?
I stated that I swabbed the interior door handle for DNA, not the exterior.
Okay. And after you testified here in court, did you review your notes from your investigation?
Yes, I did.
And what did you determine after reviewing your notes?
That I had in fact swabbed the exterior front driver's door handle and not the interior door handle.
Okay. And upon learning this discrepancy, did you notify the state attorney's office, and then we in turn notified defense counsel?
Yes, I did.
And you wanted to come here today to correct that part of your testimony?
Yes, I did.
I have no further questions.
No questions, Judge.
All right, members of the jury, do you have any questions of this witness? All right, may this witness be excused and released at this time?
Yes, Your Honor, subject to recall.
All right, well, you're excused, you're free to go about your business, but you're still subject to recall, so. All right. Okay, then at this point, members of the jury, what we're gonna do is we're gonna take a lunch break. I'd like y'all to be back here 5 to 1, all right, so we can start right up. Okay, we're gonna have our other witnesses coming, and also please make arrangements, we'll probably go later today, just in case. My understanding, I was informed by the deputy that everybody probably already had, so just in anticipation, so just to make sure. Otherwise, we'll see you back here a few minutes before 1, all right? All right, you may be seated. So Mr. Stone, I would have Ms. Sawyer here prior to 1 o'clock, so that way we can start right up, and then otherwise we can go from there. All right,
Yes,
okay?
yes.
All right, otherwise, we will be in recess at this time.